you ever heard of the Sandman? He's like a spirit or something that comes around to people that try to stay awake too late and puts them to sleep with his sand or something. I don't know much about him. I've just heard little bits from stories about him. I don't believe in him. A few months ago, I would have said it was a ridiculous story. However, after what I've experienced, I would definitely think differently. I was a mountaineer once. Not an extremely avid one, but I like to hike up a mountain, camp for the night, and hike down in the morning, at least once a month. It entertained me and gave me something to do, and I always felt a bit more like I was part of something, a part of nature almost. I also like to hike up mountains sometimes with my friend, Mark. I should have never hiked with him up there. I should never have hiked up there, period. One day, we were hiking up through the Catskills in New York. Mark and I were from Cherry Hill, New Jersey, but the Catskills was our favorite area to hike up. We would perform our usual routine, hike up, camp, then hike back down. Simple enough. As we hiked up the mountain, we passed through a small valley. It sloped upwards, and the ground was littered with broken rocks and twigs. To our right was a steep ridge, where slate poked out like curved knives and blades. To our left was a dense forest. We couldn't see far into it, because the canopy blocked out the sun and shrouded the forest in darkness. We could only make out faint shapes. I saw a squirrel skitter by. It was nearing lunchtime when a cold drop of rain fell and landed on my cheek. I looked up and realized an army of ragged, gray clouds had scuttled into view and were dropping rain down on us. Mark and I retreated into the dark forest and found a patch of trees so heavily grouped together they formed a natural umbrella over our heads. We got out our lunches and ate. I had a ham and cheese sandwich. Yeah. Mark had a Tupperware of oats and yogurt. I was always bothered that Mark would have a pretty messy lunch and just leave his equipment dirty, then throw them back into his bag. Then again, I was always a perfectionist, and Mark was very lax about things. We waited for a while and chatted as the rain came down overhead. "How much farther until we reach our spot?" Mark asked. I shrugged. "Dunno. Maybe 2-3 hours?" Mark nodded. "I think there might be other hikers here." "What makes you think that?" I asked. "I've seen a person walking around in the woods," Mark explained. "He looked like he was tired. I think he had been walking for a while." I don't know why. I still don't know why. But when Mark told me he saw someone else walking around here, something deep inside of me sent a chill up my spine. It was like a distant, primal fear was telling me that no one should be out here now. We should be the only hikers on the mountain. Then, when I thought about it, I dismissed the emotion as a silly reflex. This is a mountain open to the public. There were probably lots of people hiking there as we spoke. The rain began to let up. Not entirely, but it became bearable to walk in. "Well, I think we should get going," Mark suggested. I nodded in agreement and packed up my things. Then we were off. The entire time we walked, I thought about that man Mark had spoken of. Mark seemed fine. He walked ahead of me, occasionally whistling a bright tune, enjoying the scenery. It wasn't that I was afraid of this alleged man. I was curious. I had a strange curiosity. Who was he? Why was he here? Would we bump into him at some point? My thoughts were interrupted by a snap in the woods. Mark and I turned to the woods, continuing to walk. We saw nothing beneath those dark trees. We turned back and looked up, noticing that we were almost out of the valley. We then began to hear a wind pick up. This was not a normal wind. It was emanating from the forest. There seemed to be a breeze coming from a single source in the forest, but we couldn't feel it. I found this very strange, but Mark continued on. As we left that valley, walked away from that nearly pitch-black forest, I thought I saw a figure. A man standing there. watching us. A few hours later, Mark and I found our campsite. It was a grassy clearing in the center of the same dark forest that apparently stretched all around the mountain we were hiking up. There was a gap in the forest to the south side that housed a long, mushy path downwards. This is where Mark and I entered the clearing. We set up our tents around the edge of the forest. We were afraid if we set up in the center of the clearing, we might be in danger of lightning. Then again, we didn't know much about lightning. Later, we built a small fire and roasted sausages over it, then enjoyed a dessert of s'mores. It was a very good meal. As the sun went down, we talked about our lives, about our jobs and friends and things like that. It was a peaceful chat until we heard something coming from the forest. Again, it was that same sound of rushing wind, like some powerful stream of air was being jettisoned out of the forest and right at us. But again, we couldn't feel it, only hear it. Mike and I stared at the forest for a while. We couldn't see into the forest at all now, for it was too dark. Light or dark, we wouldn't have been able to find that source either way. It slowly died away, and Mark and I turned back to each other. Maybe it's some sort of a freak wind that's blowing a little lower, Mike suggested. He shrugged and shook his head, staring into the fire. I chuckled. That's the best guess we have, I think. Maybe it's a stream or an animal. Beats me. We both talked for a while longer, and then we decided to retreat to our tents. I sat inside of my tent, huddled up in my sleeping bag, but I was far too excited to go to sleep. I was still thinking about that mysterious man Mark had seen. The shape I thought I saw watching us. The strange wind-like noises. I was reading a novel I had brought with me when I heard Mark yell, "Good night!" I yelled the same back at him, and I heard him yawn and lay down. A minute later, I heard soft snoring from his tent. I had a lamp dangling from the ceiling of my tent, so the entire space was illuminated in warm orange light. I was enjoying my novel, enjoying it so much that I lost track of time. I kept reading and reading. I didn't notice that I had been reading for so long until I finished the novel. When I looked up from the pages, I finally felt tired, but when I checked my watch, it read 2:00. I actually laughed sort of angrily, dumbfounded. I had read until 2 in the morning. I fumbled with my bag and stuffed the book back inside. I was reaching to turn the lamp off when I heard a noise. The sound of rustling bushes and cracking twigs. I heard defined, but quiet footsteps leave the foliage and begin to tread on the dirt ground. My heart pounded. The tiredness had boosted my fear levels, but even if I was awake, I would be scared. Someone was in our campsite at 2:00 in the morning. They had to be either sleepwalking, drunk, or looking to do something bad. No normal person would invade somebody else's campsite so close to them. If he was farther away, I would be fine, but he wasn't. He was so near to my tent, to me. I heard the person mumbling. It didn't sound like a normal man. The voice was rough and seemed to grind out of his throat. It was awful to listen to. It was a wheezing, rattling, terrible voice, and they had trouble making consonants like B, P, and M. Like their lips weren't working. I heard him getting closer and closer to my tent. I heard the awful voice becoming louder and louder, the footsteps nearer and nearer. I could feel that he was about to reach my tent. I could feel him right outside. I felt a terrible, dreadful presence. I felt every hair on my body go up. I felt my stomach lurch forwards, my heart pounding. I was in a cold sweat. The only thing I thought to do was to turn off my lamp and press myself down on the ground. He stopped. The horrible voice stopped gibbering. The footsteps stopped, but I still felt his unholy presence lingering about. That's when I heard Mark begin to stir, to sit up in his sleeping bag. I silently cursed and prayed that Mark wouldn't stay awake. Whoever this man was seemed to only go for whoever wasn't sleeping. Despite my pleas, I heard the man begin to trudge over to Mark's tent. I had no idea who this man was or what he would do, but for some reason, I knew he would do something awful to Mark. I covered my mouth and pressed down on it with both hands, then lay there, hoping for the best. I suddenly heard the rushing wind. This time, that inexplicable surge of air was louder, more horrifically audible than ever before. It roared and screamed and howled like a rabid animal, filling my ears with pain. I clapped my hands over my ears, and then everything went silent. I heard Mark scream. It was not Mark's normal scream. It was a high-pitched, terrified shriek of fear. It sounded like he wasn't aware of his scream. It sounded like he was just letting loose as much noise as he could. I didn't care if that strange man was there. I needed to help Mark. I unzipped my tent and burst out, sprinting over to Mark's tent and opening the flap as quickly as I could. The man was nowhere to be seen. Inside of the tent, Mark stared up at me. He was drenched in sweat, his face pale as a ghost. His eyes were wide with horror, and he was babbling in a strange voice, like he didn't know how to speak English. "Mark, what's wrong?" I shook him. I can't," he whimpered. "What is it?" I frantically cried. "I can't hear," he screamed. Finally, I understood why his speech was so distorted. He couldn't hear what he was saying, couldn't hear me or anything around him. I sat there, staring in shock. It was all too much for me. I felt sick. I felt faint. I just wanted to be home, safe and sound. Mark's eyes were rolling back in his head, his body spasmodically convulsing. I crawled weakly out of the tent, my mind a blur, my vision clouded. I stumbled upwards and looked around, then saw something in the forest. I still can't entirely say what I saw. I don't know if what I saw was real or not, but I could try to explain it. There was a man. No, not a man. A humanoid figure. Its skin was white, totally white, like the moon. Its body was hairless and so emaciated, the bones pushed outwards like spines on a lizard. It wore a long, tattered black robe made of what looked like animal skins, all from different animals, all sewn together into one gruesome mess. The robe hung down to the ground and dragged behind the creature in the dirt. I then noticed its arms and its legs. It was constantly crouching, for its legs were twice as large as its torso, way too long, too skinny and strangely built. Its arms the same, blending into the gnarled branches of the trees. Instead of a simple elbow joint, these arms had many spots where they bent into gruesome shapes. The worst part was its face, white and expressionless. Its eyes were red and glowing like embers, staring into my soul. Its mouth was open just a bit, and its lips were sewn together with a multitude of strings and needles. I didn't scream. I stared in absolute horror at the hideous beast. Right before I passed out, the thing opened its mouth to grotesque sizes, its jaws spreading like a snake's, and I heard the sound of rushing wind. I'm currently in therapy. I have nightmares at night. I see strange things during the day. Sometimes I think that I see something out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn, it's gone. Mark was also in therapy, but I was recently told that Mark began to have a seizure one night, and as he was in the ambulance, he died. They think it was a kind of shell shock. They can't be sure, though. I'm getting better, slowly. I'm a bit more stable now. My boss even gave me a week off from work. I'm grateful that we were found. A hiker came to our campsite the next day and found me and Mark both passed out. Whatever that thing was, I'm glad we passed out before it got to us again. I don't go hiking anymore. I don't go camping anymore. It's not that I don't want to. It just brings back bad memories. I have a slight case of insomnia now, but I usually get to bed before midnight. Sometimes I accidentally stay up after that time. When I do, nothing special happens, but sometimes I swear I can hear the sound of distant,